So as probably most of the people who watch this channel know, last year I did a video entitled Žižek or Peterson, Both Please. And in that video I tried to outline some of the reasons why I think it would be productive for our culture for these two figures to have a synthetic dialogue. Now, as most of the people who are going to watch this video probably already know, Slavoj Žižek and Jordan Peterson will be finally having this conversation. And it's titled Happiness, Marxism versus Capitalism. And in this video, I just want to give a quick overview of the points where these two figures, I believe, intersect intellectually. And I also want to give my perspective on what could potentially come from this dialogue in a productive sense, in a sense that's good for the culture. So in my initial video, I argued that the main overlap and the main intersection between Žižek and Peterson is in the way in which they openly engage with Christianity, postmodernism, and psychoanalysis. On the level of Christianity, I would say that the main difference between the two figures is the philosophical modality with which they approach an understanding of historical Christianity. I think that Žižek can be said to be a dialectical materialist, meaning that he does not believe in some transcendental substance in the traditional sense, but believes that Christianity and the Christian moment actually signals a radical materialist break with any traditional substantial other world, symbolized by Jesus's death and resurrection. And Peterson is much more, in my interpretation, a psychological realist, emphasizing the transcendental experience and religious experience as a real and as something that we need to take very seriously, and even something that he would go as far as saying is more real than material reality. In regards to postmodernism, Žižek is definitely vocal about the fact that postmodernism signals a type of anti-phallogocentrism, meaning that his approach to philosophy in a Hegelian sense is seen as a power discourse, even a masculine power discourse, which would reduce or de-emphasize the importance of non-linguistic modalities of expression and experience. Whereas Peterson would, I think, agree with Žižek on phallogocentrism, and I think has explicitly emphasized similar things, tends much more towards seeing postmodernism as a type of neo-Marxist invasion of academic discourse and something that prevents us from understanding the way in which the individualism can positively function within capitalist horizons. And then in terms of psychoanalysis, I think the two differ in terms of the real with which they engage within psychoanalysis. Of course, on Žižek's side, he is firmly a Lacanian, and the real is definitely not something which has anything to do with a collective unconscious or archetypal reality, whereas on Peterson's side, he follows Jung, and the highest real there would be the Jungian archetypes, the collective unconscious, and those two reals really do inform the way in which the two of them would operate philosophically in relationship to both Christianity and postmodernism. Now, those main topics that I think are where these two thinkers intersect will not be what they'll be specifically discussing in this upcoming debate. They'll be discussing happiness, Marxism versus capitalism. And I think that the way in which this debate is structured then leads me to suggest that the central concept of happiness is where we should look for a synthesis between a Žižekian and a Petersonian philosophical engagement. Now, both thinkers, it's clear, are not conventional in their approach to the concept and the emotion of happiness. For example, Žižek has said many times happiness is a conformist category, and to give a Peterson summary on the concept of happiness, he says, happiness as the key measure of existence is so ill-informed that it is embarrassing. And so neither thinker sees happiness as a telos or an aim in itself. It could be something that comes as a byproduct of other aims, higher goals or purposes, but that happiness as a type of value which can justify and stand on its own is not something that we should be aiming for as a collective enterprise in the 21st century. Now, this belief that happiness is in itself not the aim or the purpose of a human existence is informed by both thinkers from different sources. So Žižek obviously will rely on Hegel and Lacan, whereas Peterson will often cite thinkers like Dostoevsky and Nietzsche. So on the level of Hegel, Hegel was famously quoted as saying that periods of happiness are the blank pages of history, and that's because in Hegel's understanding of history, it's always a tension, a dialectical struggle, and that the periods of harmony are actually not recorded in the history books. It's the periods of intense division, of violence, of conflict, which breed new epochs and which breed movement forward, if you like, in the dialectical process. On Lacan's side, Lacan was firmly of the belief that happiness was something that could only be stabilized by ego psychology, but that if you incorporate the id and you incorporate the meaning of the Freudian revolution, then the end of analysis does not bring you to happiness, but to the truth of your own unconscious integrations, which can be extremely difficult and even not even beneficial for your ego, or what your ego perceives as beneficial. On Peterson's side, with a figure like Dostoevsky quoting, saying that you could just give a human everything they could possibly ever want to be happy, but they would still be upset. They would still, they would almost purposefully mess things up just so that they could escape this almost suffocating, harmonious state of happiness. And then on a much more theoretical level, philosophical theoretical level, someone like Nietzsche clearly emphasized the will to power over happiness. And this could be seen in some sense as foreshadowing what emerges with the Freudian revolution, with the articulation of the pleasure principle and the drive, because with the instantiation of a type of Freudian psychometaphysics, something like the will to power, as articulated by Nietzsche, becomes identified psychoanalytically. So this brings us to the importance that both these thinkers, Žižek and Peterson, are firmly on the other side of the Freudian moment. They incorporate the Freudian moment and they try to move with the Freudian moment, albeit in different ways, with Žižek on the Lacanian side and Peterson on the Jungian side. But what they share is that the aim of the pleasure principle is happiness, and that the goal of any psychical development is to move beyond the pleasure principle towards an articulation of either pursuit of truth or power, but not power in the social system sense, power in the internal psychical sense of a type of ability to persevere and enact your highest truth. And that this is, in some sense, a imminent psychical reality of human development because of the id, because of our unconscious drives and motives, which we just have to become more aware of, even though becoming more aware of the id and becoming more aware of our psychical drives and our true motives will lead to tensions and antagonisms, what you could call secular vicissitudes, ups and downs, which will make our lives, in some sense, more difficult, but importantly for both, make our lives more meaningful. And I think that also both thinkers would agree that what you gain through letting go of ego happiness is not just responsibility for your own id, but also the horizon of an extremely meaningful existence. Now, insofar as this shared foundation will structure a debate between Marxism and capitalism, is something I can only predict or guess at. What I can say, if I'm trying to create an Iron Man of both thinkers, that Žižek would be interpreted as a type of unconventional Marxist, and Peterson is someone who I would interpret as a type of pragmatic capitalist. I don't see Peterson as someone who deifies capitalism, but merely thinks that we should work with capitalism because it's the best system we have, even though it produces inequalities. And he even is on board with the idea that we need to rethink how capitalist mechanisms redistribute wealth, but that trying to enact some communist revolution on Marxist presuppositions is, from a historical standpoint, socially irresponsible to the highest degree. Now, because of this, you could say that both philosophers, both thinkers, will be making an argument from two different standpoints on how we should move forward in our collective discourse. I know that Žižek makes an extremely high theoretically informed point that the Marxist foundation is, in some sense, foundationally problematic, but that we can revive the intent, and we can revive the ability to think beyond capitalism if we're able to read Marx through Hegel, almost like a retroactive interpretation of what would Hegel say if he was able to read the way Marx ultimately utilized his own dialectic for the political economic sphere. And then, of course, adding psychoanalysis. So for Žižek, the way in which we should interpret this, what you might call late-stage capitalism, is through the lens of the Hegelian dialectic, a Hegelian dialectic which also includes this further depths of the psychoanalytic drive, inclusive of all sorts of strange monsters and psychological phenomena which were discovered and intellectually expressed by psychoanalysis. Now, on Peterson's side, I think you have a much more conventional understanding of that capitalism is not this transcendent good or something, but that it is the best system we've ever developed, which gives the individual the most freedom. And that capitalism is also a political economic enterprise which allows us to escape collectivist ideologies which would place higher value on the group over the individual. And so Peterson will not go beyond this axiomatic foundation. For Peterson, the individual as the primary unit, the atom, the irreducible reality of our historical process, is something that communism doesn't respect. and that once you go down a road of collectivist ideology, you risk losing the central principle of the historical process, which is the importance of individual development and individual growth. And this is instantiated oftentimes in Peterson's work with reference to Piaget. And of course, on top of that, Peterson will emphasize that 20th century communism was disastrous, objectively disastrous, and that we cannot go back to that state of being. So in that sense, both Žižek and Peterson, again, even though they are quite different in terms of their understandings of political economic sphere, both seek to remind us that Marxism as a theory and a practice is flawed, and that we need to think through this fundamentally, foundationally, if we are going to have a new discourse. And the way in which both will approach that new discourse is slightly different, but possibly we can look for synthetic understanding when they come together. So for Žižek, he would emphasize that what we need to rethink is a new universal left, and that there is no universal left today in the sense that a universal left functioned in the 20th century, and that the main things we should be paying attention to in order to understand a new left would be to think, what were the main problems of commune life? What were the main problems of pragmatic organization? So you can't just have this utopian image of a perfectly functioning commune and have the revolution and then think, what's going to happen with the bus services, the educational services, the healthcare services? What are the pragmatics of a post-capitalist system which would function on a universal level? And that's not a marginal, or it's not something we can just have faith that it will happen. We need to really think about the concrete details. And in thinking about those concrete details, we have to also consider how our environment's going to be changing with the emergence of crazy technologies like biogenetics, like artificial intelligence, like robotics, and how can a left think the incorporation of these technologies into a new universal system? Whereas Peterson will not emphasize these big collective projects, and he'll much more emphasize, okay, let's go back to the foundations of the psyche. Let's go back to understanding our own self on a fundamental level. And if we transform our self-conception and we just focus on being the best versions of ourselves that we can, then we can build out a better capitalist system from solid foundations, from solid psychological foundations. So two very different approaches, but how can these two approaches be put into dialogue? Is there a different way we can articulate a relationship between these two perspectives? And that's where I come to what is at stake in this conversation. I think what is ultimately at stake in this conversation are four huge dimensions of our current ideological conversation, which do require a more sophisticated engagement. So on the one hand, we are living in not just an era of neoliberalism in terms of capitalism, but that this era of neoliberalism allows us to get swept away or lost in the pleasure principle, where everyone is trying to be happy and everyone is trying to follow simple pleasures, immediate pleasures, and not thinking about long-term ethical engagement. How can we once again think of long-term ethical engagement and the biggest possible picture that we can imagine? It can't just be about individual happiness and satisfaction in the moment. It has to be larger than that. And then in order to actually enact that, we have to be able to affirm that we're heading into new psychical territory where there will be vicissitudes, where there will be ups and downs. It's not just positive emotion. We have to better understand negative emotion, and we have to understand the way positive and negative emotion interact. It's a dynamical emotional process, and that you cannot achieve or reach some form of enlightenment or some form of higher drive unless you're willing to take the pain, unless you're willing to go through really tough times, because that's where the meaning is found. Now, the third thing we might gain from this conversation is a new discourse on the individual and the collective. It's true that if you have a culture which is too focused on the collective, that you lose sight of individual psychical reality. On the other hand, if you go too far on the level of the individual, you can get trapped in an isolated, or you can get trapped in a lonely society where we no longer are capable of forming intimate, healthy, functioning social bonds. And so both need to be thought in a very radical way. There needs to be a new conversation on ethics and morality in these individual collective spaces. And how does that take place? What does that discourse look like? Finally, fourth is to integrate historical darkness and shadows. Both Žižek and Peterson agree that the 20th century communist project failed. It failed miserably. And so this needs to be accepted fully, and especially probably by people on the left, so that we can have new ideas and a new theoretical structure to inform what would a post-capitalist or a more equal society actually look like. How would that work? And so finally, I just want to give a quote from Žižek, where he was interviewed for his book Less Than Nothing, which I'm covering, and I'm going to leave a link at the end of this video where you can see a video series I've been producing on Less Than Nothing. And this quote captures why Žižek wrote Less Than Nothing, and I hope that it will give you some perspective on where he's trying to develop his theories for the 21st century. So to give the quote: "My main concern is the deadlock of the left in mainstream global politics. We all feel that there is some potential crisis looming, that something has to be changed, but there seems to be no capacity of the left to formulate again a global project, the way the left did 100 years ago with communist revolution. We have to return to the very origins. Was it already something in Marx that was not developed enough? We have to ask radical questions. Why Hegel? Philosophy, in terms of asking the big metaphysical questions, is returning, and here I think Hegel matters. I think there is a clear parallel between Hegel's time and our time. Hegel's time was the time of the end of traditional society. The modern world was emerging, but it wasn't yet clear what this new world would be. It was a moment of tradition with great confusions. Our times are similar. It is clear that capitalist modernity is coming to an end, but it is not so clear what is the next thing. The situation is much more open. The point is not to return to Hegel the way he was, but to repeat Hegel, to repeat the same gesture, as it were. By repeating, I don't mean doing the same. I mean repeating in the sense of doing what Hegel did, but better than Hegel, as it should be done in new times." So you can see with this quote that what Žižek is aiming at is to go back to the foundations of the rotten core of Marxism, which potentially led to totalitarian states, and that we should not just continue to make that same mistake again, but go to actually the philosophical foundation which produced Marxism, which was Hegelian dialectics, and to think through political economics in a new way. And by doing this, we are capable possibly of really making sense of some of the main challenges of our era. All of the challenges of individual development, psychological reality, the challenges of ecological relationship to the planet, the challenges of what's going to become of capitalism and the sharing economy, what's going to become of capitalism in the age of automation, what's going to become of capitalism in the era of intelligent machines. All of these things are things that we don't really have a discourse to approach in a sensible way, and we're paying for it. So that's, I think, what is at stake ultimately. So that gives you an overview of at least my interpretation and my hopes for a conversation between Žižek and Peterson, happiness, Marxism versus capitalism. I think there's much overlap between these two figures, and I think that the whole political conversation benefits if it can be a productive conversation and a synthetic conversation. So I'll leave with that, and finally I'll leave a box above my head where you can find my Less Than Nothing video series, where I try to make sense of all the dense chapters within Less Than Nothing. And thank you for paying attention so far, and thank you for watching this video.